The rain had been falling on Normandy for 3 days straight, and the mud had swallowed a horse up to its chest before the beast finally stopped screaming. That single image, a war horse drowning in its own pasture, too exhausted and too burdened to pull free, tells you more about the 100 Years' War than any coronation ceremony ever could. Because here's the thing most people never hear. The famous battles, the ones with the long bows and the shining armor and the dramatic charges, those were the exceptions. Those were the punctuation marks. The actual war, the one that ground on for over a century, was mostly this: mud, hunger, fire, and the slow, patient destruction of everything that made life worth living.
As you can see here,
And if you've ever sat through a history class where the 100 Years' War got condensed into a single slide with 2 dates and a map, you've been cheated. You've been handed the skeleton and told it was the animal. The flesh, the blood, the stink, the terror. That's what we're going to dig into now. Because the real story of the 100 Years' War isn't about kings sitting on thrones issuing noble declarations. It's about what happens when 2 crowns claim the same land, and the people living on that land learn that their crops, their homes, and their lives are just bargaining chips in a game they were never invited to play. It's a story that lasted 116 years. Not 100, not a neat round number, but 116, which means there are people who were born into this war, lived their entire lives inside it, and died without ever knowing what peace felt like. That's the scale we're dealing with. That's the truth that no single slide can hold. Now, before we go further, let me take you back to the beginning. Not the official beginning with the fancy dates and the legal claims, but the human beginning, the moment you can feel in your bones, even 6 centuries later. Picture a French countryside in the early years of the 14th century. The fields are green, the villages are small, but alive, with smoke curling from chimneys and the sound of church bells marking the hours. People wake before dawn, work until dark, and measure their lives in harvests, not in years. And then, at the top of that world, a single king dies without a direct heir, and suddenly, every nobleman in Europe starts doing the math, reaching for the crown, and pulling the entire continent into a crisis that will outlive everyone in that room. That's the thing about the 100 Years' War that the textbooks never quite communicate. It didn't start with a battle. It started with an empty throne and a legal argument. The English king claimed he had a better right to the French crown than the French king's own cousin. It was a family dispute, dressed up in heraldry and legal documents that somehow managed to set 2 nations on fire for over a century. And the first crack in the official story, the first sign that this was not going to be a clean, honorable war of knights and codes, it happened early, and it happened ugly. The English didn't come to France to fight glorious battles. They came to take what they claimed was theirs. And when the French resisted, the English did what armies have always done when they're outnumbered in hostile territory. They started burning. Villages, granaries, mills, orchards, everything that fed the French army and the French people went up in smoke. It wasn't just a tactic, it was a statement. The English were telling the French, you can't feed your soldiers, you can't shelter your people, and you can't stop us from taking every scrap of food you've worked all year to grow. No banners, no honor, just fire and farmland turning to ash. That's the opening act your textbook conveniently skipped. Subscribe now because we're about to name the strategy behind that ash, and you're going to want to hear what it was really like. And if you're already smelling the smoke, drop the word smoke in the comments. And this strategy had a name. One you've probably heard in a strategy game without ever understanding the horror behind it. The chevauchée, a raid. But not the kind that happens in an afternoon. These were campaigns that could last months, with armies of thousands riding through the heart of France, leaving a scar of ash and starvation behind them that took a generation to heal. This is where the smell comes in. If you could smell the 100 Years' War, it would be smoke. always smoke, mixed with the rotting sweetness of unburied livestock and the sharp metallic tang of blood that had soaked into the earth so deeply it never quite washed away. The chroniclers of the time, the monks who wrote down what they saw, they came back to the same image again and again. Villages that were nothing but blackened stones and silence, fields that had been torched so thoroughly that the earth itself seemed to have given up. But here's what nobody tells you about the chevauchée, the part that makes it even darker than the burning and the starvation. The point wasn't just to destroy, it was to humiliate, to prove that the French king couldn't protect his own people. Every village that went up in flames was a message carved into the landscape, delivered directly to the French crown. And the French king, trapped in his palace, had two choices: face the English in open battle and risk losing everything, or sit behind his walls while his kingdom burned and watch his authority crumble. Either way, he lost. Either way, the war continued. Now, you might be thinking, okay, but the English are the villains here, right? They're the ones burning the villages. And that's true, as far as it goes. But the 100 Years' War is not a simple story with a clear hero and a clear villain. It's a machine, and once it started turning, it crushed everyone who got too close to it, regardless of which banner they fought under. Because the French didn't just sit there and take it. They answered the chevauchée with their own violence, their own brutality. When French forces caught English soldiers separated from their army, the treatment was swift and merciless. Prisoners who couldn't pay a ransom, and most foot soldiers couldn't, were killed. Not quickly either if there was time for cruelty. Because in this war, mercy had a price tag, and most people couldn't afford it. That's the human underbelly of the whole conflict, the part that makes you want to look away. The 100 Years' War was fought mostly by men who weren't professional soldiers. They were farmers, laborers, men pulled from their fields and handed weapons they barely knew how to use. They marched for weeks in armor that chafed and boots that fell apart, ate food that was rotten more often than not, and slept in the open in weather that would make a modern camper quit in a single night. And for what? For the chance to die in a muddy field for a lord they'd never met, to win a war that wouldn't end in their lifetime. But before I get ahead of myself, let me back up, because there's a person at the center of all this that you need to meet. And no, it's not a king. It's not a general. It's the kind of person the history books barely mention, the kind of person who operated in the shadows while the thrones did their loud, messy business. Let me tell you about a man whose name you've almost certainly never heard, and how he shows us the war from a completely different angle. His name was Bertrand du Guesclin, and if you've never heard of him, you're in good company, because the men who wrote the history books preferred to write about kings and battles, not about the ugly, clever, deeply unglamorous business of actually winning a war. Du Guesclin wasn't tall, wasn't handsome, wasn't born into the highest ranks of the nobility. By all accounts, he was plain-faced and stocky, the kind of man you'd walk past in a market without a second glance. But he understood something that the fancy knights with their shining armor never quite grasped. This war wasn't going to be won by chivalry. It was going to be won by whoever was willing to fight dirtier. Du Guesclin saw the future, and it had nothing to do with polished armor or fair fights. If you want to keep getting the real story, the kind they never taught you in school, then subscribe right now, because we're just getting to the part where everything falls apart. And in the comments, tell me, when you think of medieval warfare, what's the one word you'd use now that you've met Du Guesclin? I want to see it. And that's the real secret buried underneath the whole 100 Years' War. The one that makes everything else click into place. The age of the knight, the age of the glorious charge and the noble duel, was dying. And this war is the autopsy. Du Guesclin was one of the first people in Europe to fully understand that the future belonged to the man who could move an army through mud, feed it, and keep it alive long enough to win. Not the man who could ride the prettiest horse. He didn't seek out glorious battles. He avoided them whenever he could. Because he knew something that sounds almost obvious when you say it out loud. A battle is a gamble, and gambles are for people who can afford to lose. So instead of charging, he did the thing that made the old school knights despise him. He raided, he harassed, he cut supply lines and ambushed stragglers and made the English armies starve in the field they thought they were conquering. He turned the chevauchee back on the people who invented it. And that's the irony that should make you smile. The English spent decades burning French land to prove the French king couldn't protect his people. Then a French commander showed up who didn't care about protecting land at all. He cared about protecting people, which meant he refused to give the English the pitched battle they desperately wanted. And without that battle, without that chance to crush the French army in one stroke, the English found their grand strategy turning to ash in their own mouths. You see, there's a catch to the chevauchee that the English commanders learned the hard way. And it's the kind of lesson that only comes after years of marching through your own scorched earth. Burning villages feels powerful when you're doing it to someone else. But when the campaign drags on, and the supply lines stretch thin, and the countryside you've destroyed is the only source of food for 100 miles, you start to realize you've been eating your own future. The English armies that rode into France, so confident, so sure of their longbows and their discipline, found themselves marching through a wasteland where there was nothing left to take. They had burned the bread, and now they were the ones going hungry. That's the pivot nobody puts in the history books. That's the moment the war turned. When the French stopped trying to win battles and started trying to outlast the English instead, everything shifted. The war became a war of attrition, a grinding, miserable decade after decade test of which kingdom could bleed longer before it collapsed. And in that kind of war, the knight with his shining armor and his code of honor isn't an asset. He's a liability. Because he costs a fortune to equip, he demands ransom when he's captured, and he's completely useless when the real work is slogging through a muddy forest at night to burn an enemy granary. Du Guesclin understood all of this in his bones, and he built his entire career on it. He didn't fight like a knight. He fought like a man who had read the scoreboard and realized the game was rigged. So he changed the game. He used the landscape the way a chess player uses the board, forcing the English to chase him through terrain that slowed their cavalry and broke their supply wagons. He knew every ford, every forest path, every village that could shelter 100 men for a night. And when he did accept battle, he picked the ground so carefully that the English might as well have been fighting in a swamp with their hands tied. This is where the war stops being a story about kings and starts being a story about logistics, about grain and horseshoes, and 1,000 small things that decide who eats and who starves. The 100 Years' War wasn't won by the side with the better cause or the more righteous claim. It was won by the side that could feed its armies, pay its soldiers, and keep its men from deserting when the pay stopped coming. And that's a truth that applies to every war ever fought, in every century, on every continent. You can have the finest swords and the bravest hearts in the world, but if your soldiers haven't eaten in 3 days, you don't have an army. You have a funeral procession that hasn't figured out the order of march yet. And here's where it gets even more personal, because this isn't just about strategy and supply lines. This is about what war does to the people who actually fight it, the ones who don't get statues and don't get their names in the chronicles. Think about the soldier on the ground, the farmer pulled from his field, marching through that ash and mud. He doesn't know about claims to the throne or legal arguments over inheritance. All he knows is that his village is gone, his family is scattered or dead, and the only thing left to him is the army he's been forced to join. And when he looks at the enemy, he doesn't see a fellow Christian or a man with a different king. He sees the person who burned his home. And that kind of hatred doesn't end when the war does. It gets passed down to the next generation, and the next, until the war becomes a family heirloom, a grudge that outlives everyone who had a reason to hold it. That's the terrible engine that kept the 100 Years' War running for 116 years. It wasn't the kings, not really. It was the hatred, the poverty, the desperation, the sheer momentum of a conflict that had become a way of life. There were whole regions of France where people had never known anything but war, where the oldest person in the village couldn't remember a time when the fields weren't burned and the roads weren't dangerous. For them, peace wasn't a memory. It was a rumor. And rumors, as any soldier will tell you, are not something you build a life on. Now I want you to do something for me. I want you to think about the last time you had a bad day, a flat tire, a missed deadline, a broken phone. Hold on to that feeling, just for a second. Now multiply it by 1,000 and stretch it out over a lifetime, and add the constant grinding terror of knowing that armed men might ride over the hill at any moment to take everything you own and burn what they can't carry. That was the normal life of a peasant in the 100 Years' War. That was the baseline. And the fact that those people didn't just lie down and die, the fact that they rebuilt their villages after every raid and planted their crops after every burning, is honestly one of the most quietly heroic things in all of human history. That quiet heroism, that stubborn refusal to be erased. It's the real story underneath every textbook chapter. Subscribe right now so you don't miss a single one of these buried truths, because there's a whole brutal, breathtaking history waiting for you. And if that image of peasants rebuilding their villages after every raid landed somewhere deep, drop the phrase, "quiet hero," in the comments. I want to see who really felt that. Because here's the thing about the people who lived through this war that the kings never quite understood. They were not pawns. They were survivors. They had their own networks, their own knowledge, their own stubborn refusal to be erased. And when the armies marched through, when the chevauchés came and went, the peasants did what peasants have always done when the world collapses around them. They hid what they could. They rebuilt what they lost. And they waited. They waited for the armies to move on. They waited for the harvest to come in. They waited for the war to end. A war that, for many of them, never did end in their lifetime. That's the scale you have to hold in your head when you think about the 100 Years' War. It's not a single story with a beginning, a middle, and an end. It's 1,000 overlapping stories, 1,000,000 individual lives, each one a thread in a tapestry so vast and so stained with blood that you can never see the whole thing at once. You can only pick out a single thread, a king, a battle, a knight like du Guesclin, and follow it for a while, hoping it will show you something true about the whole. And if you follow du Guesclin's thread far enough, you start to see the shape of the entire war. You see the old world of chivalry dying, gasping for breath, refusing to admit it's finished. You see the new world of professional armies and economic warfare being born out of the ashes. And you see that the men who actually shaped this war, the ones who decided whether thousands lived or died, were not the ones wearing the crowns. They were the ones who understood that war is not a game of honor. It is a machine. And the only question is whether you learn to run the machine before it runs you. So when the English finally lost, when the last English stronghold fell, and the war sputtered to its exhausted, undramatic end, the peace that followed was not a victory of knights or kings. It was a victory of patience, of endurance, of the stubborn refusal of ordinary people to be erased from their own land. And that's a victory that doesn't get a parade. It doesn't get a statue. It doesn't even get a mention in most history books. But it's the victory that actually mattered, because it meant that after 116 years of fire and mud and blood, the people were still there. The fields were still there. The land itself, scarred and grieving and exhausted, was still there, waiting for the next chapter, the next war, the next test of whether human beings can survive their own worst instincts. And that, more than any battle, is the real legacy of the 100 Years' War. Not a story of glorious victory, not a story of noble defeat, but a story of survival, of the slow, stubborn, unglamorous work of staying alive when the world around you is burning to the ground. You come out of that war, if you come out of it at all, with a deep understanding of what really matters. Not titles, not banners, not the fancy claims of distant kings. The things that matter are the ones you can hold in your hands. Food, shelter, family, the ground under your feet, and the people who lived through those 116 years. The ones who raised their children in the ashes and planted their crops in the shadow of the next raid. They knew that truth better than any king ever did. They knew that everything else is just noise.